Thank you for joining our book review channel or visiting it like you're doing now. I appreciate your attention. I want to start the discussion by talking about the channel first and then diving into the reviews themselves. This channel is intended to review the books that are fairly popular and are being read all around the world. These reflect my views. Generally, they correspond to the popular views of what people think about the books, but sometimes not. So, like I said, this is basically what my impressions were after reading that book, and therefore sometimes it may be contrary to what you think about the books, which is why I welcome your comments so that I can read and, if necessary, respond to contrary opinions about the same book that I am discussing. In addition, I want to tell you that this is a book review channel, and therefore it's not about a particular book. It's going to be about all kinds of books, some fiction, some non-fiction. Any book that is generally popular is going to be discussed here in multiple episodes as we proceed along. Different books are going to be discussed, different genres are going to be discussed as we go along this journey. At the end of this channel, of course, after you listen to this, if you like the content or if you like this kind of content, I would request you to please subscribe to this channel, like this video, and also press the bell icon so that you get notifications about future videos that we plan to make. This goes a long way in keeping our work going. Having said that, now what will this channel format be? Each book that we review, we are going to give a detailed review, but we are not going to give any spoilers. We are not going to give the contents of the books, which would be unfair for the person who's written the book and owns the copyright. So it's going to be my views about the books. There will be some details. In addition, the books are going to be categorized in two ways. Number one, I'm going to categorize them in 5 different categories. It's almost like the star rating that you find in most book reviews, but it's going to be a reading rating in my view. The top one is going to be drop everything, read this right now kind of wording. That means that the book is so impressive that it is worth reading right away, and if you are in the middle of some book, it may even be worth giving that up and starting on this. So that is the top category. The second category is that read it as soon as you can. So that means it's not at the top category, but it's still a very good book, and you would benefit by giving it a priority in your reading list and reading this next. The third category is add it to your in pile to read. This means that the book is good enough, rewarding, but it doesn't need to be, you don't have to reprioritize your reading list. The fourth one would be, if you're stuck for reading material and are looking for new authors or new books, please read this. So that means it's got some interesting elements to it, but it's not something that you would love to read now or even later. The last category, of course, is that give this book a miss. It's not worth your time to read this. These are books that I did not like. Maybe still popular books, but this is what my rating is. In addition to that, at the end of the review, I will also give a rating out of 10. I'll give a ranking. Maybe a book is 6 out of 10, maybe a book is 9 out of 10. So that kind of rating will also be given after each book review. The last thing that I want to tell you is there may be one book review in a video, or there might be multiple books reviewed if there is not a whole lot to tell about one book. We will finish the review quickly, give the category and the rating, and then move on to the next book, and so on and so forth. I hope you like it, and your comments whether it's in agreement or in disagreement. I'd like to hear and would greatly benefit from that. I'm going to read every comment that you are going to post, and I hope that you like the channel content. Thank you, and let's start with the first book. The book we are going to review in this episode is a book called Postwar. It's written by an author called Tony Judt, as I understand the author's name to be pronounced. We are going to look into the surprising aspects in this book. This book actually blew my socks off, so to speak. This book covers history, specifically European history, and covers the period after the Second World War until when the book was published in 2005. It's a doorstop of a book. The book that I read was 733 pages. So let's see who will like this book and who will not like this book, so that you are aware of it right from the beginning. One, if you like history and want to understand more, then you should read this book. If you want to be surprised by history, detailed history that is, then you should read this book, because it blew my socks off multiple times when I was reading through this, and I was constantly saying, oh, I didn't know this, that kind of stuff. So if you are interested in that kind of history written in a very interesting form, then this is the book for you. Who cannot read this book? If you are not interested in history or in detailed history at that level, whether it's surprising or not, I don't think you'll enjoy this book. Second, if you are discouraged by the size of this book, then this book may not be for you. For all that, the book is filled with surprising facts. First of all, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of books about the Second World War, which is a major war involving many countries, almost all countries in the world. But very few books focus what happened after the World War II, what each country went through, etc. This book covers the period from 1945, after Hitler's defeat. The book covers all of Europe, both the Western Europe, which was democratic and free, and also the Eastern Europe, which fell behind what is known as the Iron Curtain. And it goes through in fascinating detail for each country. And like I said, there were many surprises hidden in that book when I was reading it, which was a nice bonus. The book actually upends many of the notions that I had about post-Second World War world. The broad strokes are known to everybody. For example, the Eastern Europe was occupied by USSR or Soviet republics, and even Berlin was divided into two, half of it belonging to the East under the control of Soviets, specifically Stalin, and the Western world, which was full of free democratic countries, as we understand it. Okay, so that's well known, and we know the formation of European Common Market, which became European Union later, and many people credit it with this, with the fact that there were no wars among the European countries like it was before World War II. These things are already well known. We know that the communism collapsed in 1989-1990 time frame, and then many of the countries that were under the Soviet republics became independent. For example, Poland, for example, Hungary, that kind of thing. But there are nuances inside all of those. The biggest surprise to me is the fact that America, or US, which entered the war later, was neutral in the first part of the war, did not want to spend money on Europe to bring it forward, and they were forced to do that according to this book, and we are going to see why that happened. That's one thing. And even the book actually goes through a completely different view from the popular view, or the biased view in the author's opinion, of how events were portrayed. First of all, let's start with Austria. As soon as the war was over and Hitler was defeated, Austria was designated as the first victim of the Nazi rule and therefore worthy of given support by the Western powers. Whereas the author contends that Austria was willfully aiding and abetting the Nazi atrocities against the Jews, and that was actually pushed under the carpet for the geopolitical benefits of the Western countries. That's what the author contends. That was my first surprise. In the author's telling, they glorified Vienna's past as the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, while they were mute about the bad treatment given to the Jews that were in Austria, especially the forced migration of Jews to the eastern part of the country when Nazi rule was going on in Germany. The author also argues that Germany was not asked to pay repatriation for the war damages that it caused all over Europe. Germany was itself attacked and was lost a lot of property and had to spend money reconstructing. The author argues that the devastation was much less than, for example, Central European countries, where the cost of reconstruction was sky high, and Germany actually got off lightly. And the author also argues that the reason for Germany being let off so-called lightly is not just that they learned the lesson from the end of the First World War, where Germany was asked to pay repatriation when it was devastated, and that gave rise to Hitler and the Nazi rule, the Third Reich, so to speak. But they also say that the main reason for Germany being let off so lightly was because it was in the Western camp, and not just that, immediately after the Second World War, the Cold War became the major concern of the Western countries, and the spread of communism was something that was heavily feared, and therefore Western Germany was considered to be in the Western camp, democratic, and therefore should be supported. I'm not going to go through and give evidence that the book gives, so I'd like you to read the book if you want to know how he says many of the surprisingly different views in this book. Please go ahead and read the book. Borrow it. He also attacks the common notion that there was peace and prosperity after the Second World War and there were no major wars. Yeah, there was peace. In the Eastern Europe especially, there was peace, but there was no prosperity. And the peace that was established in the Eastern European countries, according to the author, is the peace of the prison yard. Does that not create a powerful imagery in your mind? Just like the prison where the jailers enforced discipline, the Red Army, which came to fight Hitler and occupied up to half of Germany, never left after the war and still stayed in all the countries that eventually fell into the Soviet Union. So that's one. And secondly, the Red Army and the countries repressed any even a token of opposition or rebellion or contrary thoughts, and therefore the peace that the East Europe enjoyed was the peace of the prison yard. What an excellent analogy. The author also presents a very interesting concept in a different context. Now, you know that the Western European countries were allowed to be free, have their own governments, and even generate the industrial capacity to get back to richness. Was it all the very altruistic motives of mainly US? And no, the argument goes that after the war, the Western Europe was devastated and France was in dire straits financially, economically, and Germany was actually bombarded and had to reconstruct. Later, we are going to see that in comparison with Central Europe, but it was devastated and it needed money to reconstruct, and their industries were all had to come back. So why was US so generous in not just allowing the democracy to thrive and the industry to be rebuilt, but also providing protection against the expansion of communism? The author's contention is that the main reason is that this very devastation that I talked about created a seductive attraction for communism, which the French communists and the German communists were trying to exploit, and saying to the people that the best way forward for those countries was to join the Soviet Empire and become communist. And the Cold War started almost immediately after the Second World War. Secondly, the Second World War has just ended. The Nazi atrocities were being revealed to the world, and U.S. and England and others, the victorious powers, were afraid that if Germany was allowed to suffer, Nazism could come back in that form or another form, and so they wanted to prevent that as well. And that caused the creation of the Marshall Plan, which is basically US money pouring into Western Europe to make sure that those countries were recovered sufficiently from the devastations of the war. Not just that, there are more interesting nuances about the Marshall Plan and how it was formed, etc., which we will talk about in a few minutes. As a result of this, it is stunning that the Nazi collaborators and some people in the Nazi government themselves were let off relatively free. Yes, there was a Nuremberg trial where the top Nazis were prosecuted and punished, and certain other Nazi and Gestapo people were hunted down many years later and exposed and punished, etc. But the people under them on the government hierarchy were let off relatively free. And that is a stunning fact, and there are reasons for it. One is that the rebuilding of the countries required talent, and the people who were in power before were the ones that were talented, and expunging them en masse and bringing in new people was not practical in many countries. And these countries needed to get prosperous so that US can stop pouring money year after year into Europe. Another thing that all of us know is the fact that the Germany went conquering country after country after country, so the Nazism spread all over Europe, and they almost came to the doorstep of Russia. And Russian cold, like it did for Napoleon several years before, was a factor in the defeat of Hitler as well, when he looked unstoppable. Similarly, we know that. But what we do not know, and the author tells us, is that Germany, unlike all the previous empires which expanded, used the resources of the conquered countries to fuel further expansion. So they used the country's resources, sometimes army, under the Nazi leadership, to fuel their further expansion, and that is a surprising fact for me. How is it for you? This staged expansion gave them two advantages. One is that when the war was happening, it was happening far from German borders, so Germany itself suffered much less devastation in the process, and all the destruction happened at the border of expansion. That's number one. Number two, when the Red Army came from the east and the Allied countries came from the west, again, the countries that suffered the most were the border countries, now the shrinking border countries. Until towards the end of the war, Germany was bombed. I know that England bombed Germany, and even so, in comparison, the Eastern European countries suffered a lot more devastation than Germany itself did. And that caused more devastation in Central Europe, for example, than in Germany itself. And even taking that fact, some of the examples that he quotes are still astonishing. He says that 80% of the city of Minsk was destroyed in the Second World War. And also, if you come to Yugoslavia, he says that 25% of all its vineyards were lost, 50% of its livestock was lost, 60% of its roads were destroyed, and 70% of all its bridges were destroyed in the war. So compared to that, Germany did suffer some devastations towards the end of the war, but it is in proportion much smaller. Surprising. The other astonishing fact is that as the Red Army was advancing towards the end of the war, the did a lot of raping of women in all the countries that they traveled through. And that's a surprising fact that it was not known to me, at least. And more astonishing is Stalin's views on it. And these things happen in a war. When I read this book, I get two impressions. One is the author is even-handed, so he actually talks about the atrocities conducted on both the Western camp and the Soviet Union. And secondly, he is full of astonishing facts. For example, he tells us that 4 out of 10 Jews who were released from the concentration camp after the Allied victory subsequently died. Remember, these are the people who survived the concentration camp conditions and lived to see the end of the war and their liberation, but they were so malnourished they could not be saved by the power of the Western medicine as it existed at that time. That's one thing. Secondly, he says that in Czechoslovakia, for example, the ethnic Germans who were living there during or even before the Nazi regime lost their property almost immediately after the defeat of Hitler, and soon after they also lost their citizenship because they were force evacuated back to Germany. In Poland, again, a very similar thing happened where the ethnic Germans were mass evacuated and they were sent to Germany, in this case the West Germany, where they thrived subsequently. The people who had escaped to the Western Europe, Ukrainians for example, were very reluctant to go back to their country, which was now under communist and Soviet rule, but they were forced to go by the Western powers, and so they had to go back to their country, where they were immediately arrested and sent either to Siberia or some other gulag and condemned to hard labor. None of this is prominently known by many people, definitely not by me, and that is in itself a very surprising fact. Maybe it shouldn't surprise us, but it's still astonishing to read that the Nazi collaborators outnumbered the resistance forces by many, many times until almost the end of World War II. In addition, the Jews had a resettlement problem. The Eastern Europeans didn't want them, in spite of the fact that they claimed to have rescued them later. And the Western countries didn't want to take them back. So they had no country to go to, and they were not being treated well in the countries where they were until the State of Israel was created in the Middle East, and en masse all the Jews who wanted to move there decided to migrate. Okay, so Nazism was defeated, Nazis were gone, and the people who resisted the Nazi regime fearlessly at the risk to their lives were now celebrated as heroes and were put in positions of power, right? That happens in storybooks, but in reality, nothing like that happened. Especially in the Eastern Europe, the people who fought against the Nazis in the resistance forces were sidelined for two reasons. One, they were not just opposed to Nazism, they were also opposed to communism. So there was no way that the new communist government would take them into their fold. Secondly, even the existing governments in many of the communist countries were ultimately purged in a huge mass purge trial of Stalin, which shocked the Western world, and communists who were there in the countries were installed in power at that time, so they did no time or attention to pay for the resistance fighters who fought bravely against Nazism. Okay, that's the story for the Eastern Europe. On the Western Europe, what happened? There are some shocking developments there too. Like I said, the Nazis were not sidelined after the defeat of Germany, Nazi Germany, but were kept in many countries and kept in positions of power in many countries. Pietro Badoglio, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name right, was one of Mussolini's marshals, and he was instrumental in ridding Italy of Mussolini himself. But Italy let off its fascists easily, or they did not punish them because many of the judges that were there after the Italian liberation, so to speak, were Nazis, and also many of the government officials who were left over after the war were also former Nazis. Not only that, Pope Pius XII had a really warm relationship with Mussolini. Italy simply claimed to have smoothly transitioned from fascism to a democratic ally, and the Western countries accepted that argument. More shocking is how the ex-Nazi sympathizers in academia and business suffered nearly no long-time consequences and were reinstated in their positions. So what's the reason for this strange behavior? Immediately after the Second World War was over, a new enemy arose, which is actually the Soviet Union. The Western powers were alarmed at the communism as enemy number one, so therefore they had to rebuild the prosperity of the Western countries very quickly back, and therefore a lot of things were overlooked. Definitely, Pope Pius XII overlooked all the atrocities of the Nazi regime in Italy and elsewhere. If you talk about Greece, for example, all their post-war efforts in terms of creating stabilization was focused on the left and not the remaining Nazis. It's basically they were very exercised about the spread of communism, and therefore the French communists were the ones whom they were fighting against in order to gain control of the country. Even the ironically named Klaus Barbie, who is called the Butcher of Lyons during the Nazi regime, was left in place and kept all his powers intact after the Second World War. So that gives you an example of what the focus was on the Western powers. Given all this, there are some more surprises for me at least. You know that the Marshall Plan was created immediately after the World War II to help the countries rebuild, mainly by American money. But the surprise is that when I read this book, I understand that the Marshall Plan was initially supposed to apply to all the countries, including the countries under the control of the Soviet Union. And the plan was drawn up accordingly, and definitely Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia were very willing to take American money to rebuild their countries. But it was the turn of now Stalin to give in to paranoia, and he was suspicious of the underlying intentions of the Western powers to pour money into Soviet-controlled countries, and he forbade all the countries under his power to negotiate with the West, and therefore ultimately it so happened that the American money was used to develop the Western powers, not all of Europe. The author makes a very surprising point, actually. The French were suspicious of the British people. The France and Britain had long-time enmity, but after the Second World War, the distrust deepened. And the author says that the reason for this is because of the speed of defeat of the French by the Nazi forces, and also the demeaning subservience of the Vichy regime after the war until the Germany was defeated. And because of this, in all the post-war discussions that were held, it was held between Russia under Stalin, Roosevelt from America, and Churchill from England. And France was pretty much left out of all the discussions. That deepened the mistrust and the sense of injury that the French had. So this caused a problem between France and Britain, and it was also exacerbated by the Suez crisis that came up, which we are going to discuss a little bit later. The French had views that were very different from the rest of the Western European countries. For example, France was bitterly opposed to the reconstruction of Germany, especially the German arms production. They were hoping that the coal that was available in Germany would help them reconstruct the French industry if they stopped Germany from making their own industrial progress. That didn't succeed because all the other Allied countries did not have the same view about Germany after the World War II. In addition, France had a stronger relationship with the Soviet Union than many other Western European countries because of a shared suspicion with the US Anglo axis. And de Gaulle never forget the insult where he had to spend as a guest of during the World War II in England. And Roosevelt had a very low opinion of him, and de Gaulle was aware of it. And all these causes caused the enmity between France and England. In addition, when the Suez Crisis came, the French and British joined together and then tried to take over the Suez Canal back into the Western hands. America came in and put a stop to it, and he actually ordered both France and England to retreat, and they had to ignominiously retreat because US was a world power at that point in time, and their arms and army was equal to the combined force of all the Western powers at that point in time. And ever since, US has been one of the biggest superpowers in the world. So the defeat or the ignominy of being ordered by the Americans to withdraw resulted in two very different lessons being learnt by Britain and France, which caused the gulf between the two countries to widen. England decided that it is best to be aligned with America in all the geopolitical matters and, so to speak, ride on the coattails of America. However, France learned a completely different lesson. It's no point in being aligned with America because America will not listen to the European powers, and therefore France should forge its own way, whether it's aligned with America or not. So those were two different lessons learned by the two different countries which were trying to take over Suez Canal. The other thing is England spun this subservience of American goals as a special relationship that allows England to be a bridge between America and Europe, especially after England joined the European Union after a few years. Another surprise is that France actually declared neutrality in 1947. They wanted to be equidistant between America and Soviet Union, and they declared neutrality just like Switzerland did during the war in 1947, and they were reluctantly forced to abandon that stance and move towards the west because in the meanwhile the French Communist Party was reviled in France and became very unpopular. So aligning with the Soviet Union or being even midway between the Western powers and the Soviet Union was no longer politically convenient. And in addition, they wanted to trade with Germany to take their coal and develop their own industry, and that required their abandoning the neutrality and then joining the Western camp. In Eastern Europe, Stalin maintained the fiction that the goal was to have elections in all the Eastern European countries, but the real goal was to make sure that the communists took power through elections or other means. And when he found that the communists had no chance of taking over from the existing governments, then they started resorting to repression and open suppression and disqualification of opponents so that the communists can take power. Where they absolutely could not, like in Yugoslavia, where Marshal Tito was very famous, then they co-opted Tito and other rulers and made them communists. In Yugoslavia, at least, Marshal Tito was completely aligned with communism, and then he started implementing communist policies ahead of even the Soviet Union as a whole, and that caused huge irritation and ire of Stalin himself. Stalin conducted show trials of people who were opposed to them, sometimes even the resistance fighters who were opposed to Nazism, and then imprisoned or sent to concentration camps, hundreds of thousands of people, and that show trials did a lot to reduce the credibility of communism on the Western European side. The author covers the death of Stalin and the chaos that follows. Oh, Beria, the chief of the intelligence, was considered to be the most apt successor for Stalin, and he was being groomed, but he was murdered soon thereafter, and then that caused the rise of Nikita Khrushchev. Okay, are there no deficiencies in this book? Yeah, there are some. Actually, as a layman, I didn't like the pages and pages of description of the growth of arts in Germany and other Western European countries. And I thought as a layman it was way too detailed and not relevant to the main theme of the book. But those are rare, are outweighed by the detailed research that produced this book. And so overall, I'm very glad that I read this book, and I'm hoping that you would be too if you are interested in history. It's not just World War II, but the book resets your expectations, and gives you the background on why certain things that you know happened have happened. For example, it's talking about the Northern Ireland and the issue between the Protestants and the Catholics, which they call the Troubles, why it came and how it erupted, etc. One of the interesting facts about it is that the Protestants in Northern Ireland, called the Unionists, were mainly from Scotland, and that creates a really strange situation because the Protestants or the Unionists in Northern Ireland want to stay with Britain, overwhelmingly support staying within Britain than the unification with the rest of the Ireland, whereas in Scotland they want to get out of the UK and want to be independent. So it all depends on the context, I guess. And the author is not afraid to go against popular or biased views when it suits him. For example, he talks about Margaret Thatcher, who's considered to have revolutionized England. He accepts that she actually brought England prosperity, but he also points out very bluntly the kind of problems that she stored for the future and that impacted England later. Secondly, he talks about Mitterrand, who rose to be the French president, and he shows how he actually changed his views and even policies when it suited him, always rising higher and higher, finally capturing the presidency of France. The author also gives one of the best explanations I've seen in terms of why the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. Many people think that it was because of Ronald Reagan and his Star Wars program. The author debunks the myth, and he says that the main reason for it is Gorbachev. And Gorbachev, what he did is given in detail, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. But he was the main reason for Soviet Union collapsing, because he gave unprecedented liberty to the occupied territories to do certain things. And this is one of the best explanations I've heard in terms of why Soviet Union did collapse. What's equally fascinating is what Gorbachev did not expect. He was willing to let the Soviet countries go, but he wanted to protect communism in Russia itself. But that did not work out, and why it did not work out and how Boris Yeltsin forcing Gorbachev out are all described in phenomenal detail in this book, and I would encourage you to read this just for this fact, if nothing else. There are a lot of other gems in the book as well, but this is one of the highlights of the book, and it explains to you what you knew in broad strokes, like I said, and not in detail. So it was almost like looking at a pointillistic picture. If you look at the picture from afar, it creates a beautiful scene, but if you go closer, you see all the points that make up the picture. And that comes into sharp focus, and this book is something like that in my opinion. The author talks about why Czechoslovakia split up after the war, and he says that it was not totally unexpected. For example, the Czech Republic was always part of the Roman Empire, and they considered themselves superior and educated. Czech Republic was also comprised of Bohemia and Moravia, which was very highly industrialized, and they considered Slovakia to be uneducated, Slav-speaking people, and that view prevailed even in Slavic Hungary, the author says. Therefore, the background of the two countries were very different in the past, and there was a division that was created. In addition, he also talks about the split up of the Yugoslavia that happened later and why that happened. For example, in Yugoslavia, he says that the Yugoslavia might not have split itself up into constituent parts if the circumstances were a very little bit different or the leaders from the two parts had been different. For example, he says that the Macedonians, which is part of Yugoslavia, speak the Macedonian language, which is basically Hungarian with a little bit of differences. I didn't know that. Serbs and Croats speak very similar language, but the Serbs use the Cyrillic alphabet to write, and the Croats use the Latin alphabet to write, like English, for example. It reminds me of the Indian subcontinent where the Hindi and Urdu are very similar languages, but they use completely different writing systems. Hindi uses Devanagari script, whereas the Urdu uses the Arabic script. So even if the language is similar, you cannot read each other's papers, for example, and that seems to be a similar factor in Serb and Croat situation, which is a fact that I did not know as well. I'm not going to go into details, but it goes from country after country and talks about Spain, for example, why Catalan and Basque regions wanted to separate out and what is the basis of that, etc. And also in UK, why the Scots and the Welsh people wanted to secede at one point in time and what was the root cause of that, etc. It's a fascinating read. I would again encourage you to go read the book if you are interested in these kind of subjects. He talks about Belgium, where the Walloons and the French-speaking people cannot stand each other, so to speak, and yet, unlike Yugoslavia and unlike Czechoslovakia, Belgium did not split into multiple constituents, and he explains why. And these are really fascinating information. Another fascinating thing that I found was that even before Gorbachev, there was Khrushchev, and Khrushchev was communist. He had no intention of letting the Soviet empire go. However, he wanted to save communism from Stalin's repressive tactics, the purges, the tortures, and things like that. So he thought that the way to save communism was to distance Soviet Union from Stalin's tactics. So he started openly admitting that Stalin made many mistakes, and therefore it was all Stalin's mistakes and it was not communism's mistakes. And Gorbachev completed the picture many years later when he came in. And even Gorbachev, like we have said, was trying to save communism in Russia, but decided that the best way to do that would be to let the satellite countries go, like Poland, like Hungary, and like other countries. Author is clearly demonstrating how people in Hungary were helping exterminate the Jews and were collaborating with the Nazis in deporting Jews to various places. And in the Eastern Europe also, there were many countries that collaborated with the Nazis, and when the Hitler was defeated, hastily came out and then became communist country, changing their colors to suit the times, is the author's argument. There are many fascinating things in this book, and I want to really hear from you what your views are. What did you find fascinating in the book, either through this review or by reading the book? Do you disagree with any of the statements that are made in this review, etc.? Now, the last piece for this book is to categorize it. Like I said, here are the categories that we discussed before. I'm going to put them up again. So, what category does this book belong to? If you have not noticed from my review so far, I would put it at the top, which is drop everything and read that book right now. It is going to pay you back in enjoyment, in widening of your knowledge, etc. And the last piece that I want to say is I want to rank this book out of 10. I would give it easily a 9. If you are a history buff or if you are interested in world history or European history, this is a valuable addition to your knowledge base. I would uh, highly recommend that you go read the book as soon as possible. Thank you very much, and good to meet you. And I'll see you soon in the next review of another book.